I'd like to share some ideas about memory, about public space, about democracy, and I'm going to try to do. There are two parts of this presentation. One is kind of the conceptual armature that so somehow will tackle some of the questions that Erica brought to us, and some of the questions, Steve, that you also mentioned. Monument, legacy, memorial, and I tried to do that by sharing with you lots of images that I will not talk about. Okay, I will go very fast with the images as background to what I mentioned, and then by kind of the second part, of this presentation, there will be about half an hour, 35 minutes, according to what Hassan told me, and I have a clock here. So we'll try to sort of tackle some of the issues that I see as problems and as difficulties, in working in memorial spaces and design, and show you the project in Nantes for the Memorial to the Abolition of Slavery as kind of the capstone of this presentation. So, if this works, okay. So the first thing that I would like to share with you is a notion that, as Andreas Huysen suggests to us, that the act of remembering is of the present and its reference is in the past and thus absent. I'm interested in thinking about memory as an action, not as an object. Memory as a verb, not as a noun. And then I will distribute some materials, some written materials for you to take with you. But this idea to me is interesting because if we look at my dear friend, I'd never met him, Jorge Luis Borges, from the same country I come from, he talks in the Funes de Memorioso about the idea that memory, is a garbage heap. So we need to make sense of things that are in front of us, or behind us, or in the future. So how do we do that? It's almost like scraping, the kind of residues of what we see in a certain way. So I'm interested in this idea that memory is an action. The act of remembering is to be in the present, is to say, here I am, is to say, here we are, here we remember, here we bear witness to difficult pasts, which are not only in the past, but are also in the present. I'm interested in considering our work as academics, as intellectuals, as architects, historians, as public people, to include the idea of truth-telling, truth-seeking, as a kind of perhaps a louder truth-speaking about kind of without fear, against continuing human plights. I'm talking about human trafficking, genocides, present-day slavery. The work that I do professionally, and here at Roger Williams, is also related to this history. And I'm interested in looking at the questions that come from the sort of numbers that are mind-boggling. 27 million people today, statistics talking in conditions of slavery. What does it mean for us as culture? I'm interested on this, in looking at the question of trafficking, not just because it is important, but as architects, we need to be able to say something about it, or try to think about it at least. So these are some of the memory maps of our students here at Roger Williams. So the question here is in a certain way, how can we bring to the fore the idea, as Levinas reminds us, that the society is a miracle of moving out of oneself. And again, to be is to remember, and I'm thinking of a commitment to remembering in action, that may bring forth new kinds of institutions, new kind of memorial spaces, because if we think of a historic destiny, a memorial, is about recalling the past, but providing conditions for new responses in the future. And we think of it with Christoph Wodiczko as memorials as psychopolitical and ethical companions. And they should function as environments that, while illuminating events, could foster rethinking and reactualizing past and present. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that in order to transform the world, we need to think about it. But remembering, again, and I'm showing just very quickly some images, remembering is a vital activity that shapes our relation with the past and defines our future. And these are some projects that I work on, like the Holocaust Museum in Buenos Aires, the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University, that you will see a couple of images, or the Hoboken September 11 Memorial that we were one of the 4 finalists for this, or the view to the Palace of Justice that you will see many times from in the space, underground space in Nantes. But think about this: if memory is selective, memory, is subject to construction, to repression and denial. Memory is slippery, is imperfect, and we know that since the 1980s, as Erika demonstrated many times, and other thinkers, Western societies have developed a kind of an obsessive pursuit of memory, and memory has become a marker in global culture. But an important aspect of this culture, and I want to emphasize this, is the struggle for justice and human rights. It's not only the kind of the obsession with memory, that as Huysen suggests, has to do with the idea that thinking and living temporality are undergoing a significant shift. But I'm interested in the idea that the struggle for justice and human rights are connected to memory, like in Peru, where I had the couple of times invitation to discuss with the Commission of Truth and Reconciliation, in Peru, about the place for memory. So how do we think about this? Because these stories, have been coupled many times as particular nations seek to create better democracies or democratic societies in the wake of mass exterminations, slavery, apartheid, segregation, military dictatorships, and totalitarianism. So this idea of justice and memory are coupled in the world. The construction of museums and memorials, as we see this image again, is significant not only because of the number, but because of the significance they hold for those communities. And examples include, official and community-based memorials and museums, as Erika showed us, all around the world. The emergence of spontaneous memorials, and I'm repeating, pilgrimages to sites of memories like Auschwitz, and other forms of commemorative practices. But what I'm interested in is not only to suggest that these political uses and many times abuses are varied. At the core, these mythical narratives that they are constructed around memorials, histories of victors and aggrandizing monuments, all those are present. But the cultures to which they speak, I think, have become infiltrated by other kinds of memories. Repressed memories, group memories, and perhaps micro-forgotten histories. This is where I studied, University of Buenos Aires, the hall of the School of Architecture. There's a banner that has, the faces and the names and small histories of the more than 200 colleagues and friends, some people who I knew who were disappeared, during the military dictatorship. An example is these crosses in Kurapati, in Belarus, in the outskirts of Minsk, where in 1994 they regained a kind of a small form of democracy, and suddenly at night, 60 years after the Stalinist government killed so many people there in that place, crosses started to appear. And there are more than 20,000 crosses, no names, at least at the beginning. So the notion is that this site, again, held or holds a certain meaning, that is transmitted historically and culturally. Oral histories, not so much written. The work that happens here in Rhode Island, around the story of trafficking and slave trade, are important. But I'm talking about the notion that these histories have to do with those who are vanquished from society. So the idea here is, this is images of Christoph's work that I'll show in a couple of minutes, is the notion that these historic traumas are connected to the voices of those who have been many times vanquished from society. Think about this. When we say memorial in public space, when we say this is the public space of the city, we mean official monumental space, which, using Benjamin's words, Walter Benjamin, is reserved for the celebration of history of the victors. The city cultivates its memorials and historic landmarks that celebrate the memory of those who have succeeded at the expense of the forgotten memory of those who have not. Many times we forget the nameless and the vanquished. The victims, as I said, which are somehow witnesses and survivors of today's and yesterday's crimes and injustices. This success of democracy and democratic public space can be measured by its capacity to encourage and assist in the process of disruption of the continuity of the history of victors, that is, history and its symbolic narrative, by the tradition and the memory of the vanquished and the nameless through political, cultural, spatial, and yes, why not, artistic and architectural means. Again, disruption. According to Hannah Arendt, political equality means visibility. Conversely, political inequality and invisibility go hand in hand. Christoph Wodiczko and myself, who I'm presenting some of our work together, as if he was here, half of this part of this project is not here, are not only an artist and architect team, but also people whose ancestors suffered slavery and genocide. He is a Polish, partly Jew, born in hiding at the time of the Warsaw Ghetto. His father was a war slave, and I am an American-Argentinian Jew. My mother was born in Berlin in 1936 and fled Germany to South America late in 1938 when she was 1 year old. None of these, but let me emphasize this, none of these autobiographic notes should be used to somehow legitimate what we do, our work. Rather, through our individual and collective work, we feel obliged to contribute to the visibility of these and whose story and memory has been relegated to the margins of privileged field of vision, of their suffering and their struggle, and of these who struggle with and for them. This is to me the key point. And I want to emphasize this idea. Those who are the margins, those who do not have a voice, yet we have to be very clear as well. We do not speak for them. Let me quickly tell you a couple of things to try to clarify some issues that were talked about. The monument, in its oldest and most original form, is a human creation erected for a specific purpose of keeping single human deeds or events alive in the minds of future generations, Alois Riegel told us. But we know as well with Robert Musil that there's nothing more invisible than a monument. But we're talking about life and death. The Latin word monumentum derives from the verb moneo, and it means to warn. So we think that the idea of monumentality is not a shape or a form, is a quality that places our objects, specifically places, have to make us recall, evoke, and think something beyond themselves. And this is something that James Young alluded many times, the idea of something beyond itself. To me, that's the significance part of the work that we do. How do we address that beyond itself? So to work on this project raises issues which are not only artistic or architectural, but are moral, ethical, and philosophical, and many times political. So I want to move quickly to some other things. So I'm just going to embrace through these images. Let me see where we are. Okay, yeah. So think about this. The architecture itself is an important part of life, but also architecture has to do. I think I'm lost in the images. Give me 1 second. This is the problem of going quickly through some images. Okay, yeah, we're good. So, architecture is inherently a public and practical art. It is practical insofar that purpose is the driving force of the work. It is a public art in that the presence, the thingness, let's say, it constructs the space for public appearance. Architecture involves a poetic organization of matter to form inhabitable space, occurs at the horizon, and is always transformation of topography. It always relates to the idea of exile and temporality. Projects and buildings, while becoming catalysts for the process of memory, think about that. Every space you remember is because a space that triggers your imagination or your memory of it. So buildings are catalysts for process of memory, but bring forth a depth of continuity as well as the desire for ethical transformation. They are conversations in space and time. The architect's role has been to create a theater for actions and of memory, that make it possible to affirm life and contemplate a better future. But while architects, imagine, and we imagine projects and embarking journeys, that leave traces over the skin of the earth, that's the embankment in Nantes. Our work often lies in uncovering histories and memories and anchoring histories and memories to territory, sites, and places. But it is also in the face of catastrophe, historic traumas, and historic injustice that this role, the role of the architect and the artist, become complex, problematic, and we only hope necessary. But that's only a hope. In working in these kinds of projects professionally in academia, we need to be wary of the expectation of creating instant metaphors, artificial meanings, or to maintain historical myths, like, Lincoln freed the slaves without any kind of agency from the slaves themselves, as this culture suggests. So we have to remember that what architectural and artistic practices can do is to establish a dialogic relation with traumatic events and help frame the process towards understanding. Help frame the process towards understanding. Indeed, to work through these kinds of work requires a persistent attempt to transform the public sphere. It involves establishing ethical frameworks to position ourselves as engaged witnesses, and demands precise dialogic and committed attitudes towards design, towards techniques, towards materials, towards sites of memory, toward history, towards the voices of others. And this is important. Who are those others in democratic life? Who are those others who actually protest, and tells us stories? Those others are an enigma. An enigma of a face that resists possession, as Levinas told us. An enigma that cannot be fully known and cannot be reduced to content. And this is the ethical question. How do you relate to those others who you don't know, but are still waiting for a certain ethical response? And I don't mean only empathy, ethical response. Like in Peru, the only remains of this person is the photograph. Philosophers like Giorgio Agamben have theorized the position of the witness as the basis of ethico-political relations, insofar as the witness answers to the suffering of others without usurping the place of the other. The witness answers to the suffering of others without usurping the place of the other. That's why Homer comes to tell us about something about that. So witnessing is a way of seeing and listening that requires the acceptance of vulnerability. Witnessing requires a renunciation to the will to mastery. For, as trauma theorist Kathy Caroth argues, to bear witness to the truth of suffering of a traumatic event is to bear witness to that event's incomprehensibility. That poses problems to any kind of representation that want to respond to the suffering of others. Again, this is to me key. How do we address histories and memories? Like in Nantes, how do we address the stories of the desaparecidos in Buenos Aires, in Argentina, in South America? So let me quickly show you a 1-minute clip about a projection in Hiroshima, that will help us, look a little bit. This is a projection that Christoph did in Hiroshima. So this is a projection in Hiroshima, and basically survivors telling the story of the place, what happened. This is one short clip.
Can you move the cursor so it's not the subtitles aren't blocked?
54年前の人々は助けを求め、後ろから火が追っかける木造がやられるカーラが沈む川の中に飛び込みました。飛び込んだんですよ。毒と知らないで、放射能と知らないで。その人間がこの川の水面に見えないだけ死骸が浮いてたんです。川の流れは神から流れて、そしてまたそのドームの前を通って、そして左に上がりますね。そして54年前は人々は川に飛び込みました。助けてくださいと手を動かしました。でも帰ってきません。沈みました。でも
So what we're talking about is this difficulty to both witness a story, listen to a story, and actually tell a story. You know, and in that context, I just want to go very quickly through this so we can get to some of the images of the project in France. What I tried to suggest to all of us is the notion that we're talking about elusive stories, you know, difficult memories, impossibility of telling, you know, the kind of impossibility of comprehend, you know, a traumatic story. So how do we position ourselves, you know, as architects, as artists, you know? And I suggest for a moment that the idea is that we need to inhabit the distance between one's place for action, you know, the approach, I call it ethical deferral. That means to inhabit the distance as one place for action, inhabiting the distance between act and remembrance, the distance between recollected worlds and worlds to be transformed. This entails a certain presence and authorship through the dynamic interaction and imbrication of conceptual and material worlds, with a goal of effacing oneself from the scene. The goal is not to be present, not to be seen by others, but actually help others frame their presence in space. This was a project that was, you know, is not happening so far, but steel that was brought to Denver, we brought to Denver to create a space where the steel is seen, you know, horizontally, you know, in the, you know, as we saw it, you know, in Hangar 17, you know, and but I just want to go quickly to the project in France, so we can move to some conversation, you know, after. Let me just quickly tell you a couple of things. The project in France, you know, it has to do with what we call a working memorial, you know, that provides space and means, you know, to remember and think about slavery and slave trade, you know, commemorate resistance and the abolitionist struggle, and celebrate the act of abolition, but especially to bring visitors closer to the question of the present day, you know, struggle against forms of slavery today. We think about more than 300 years of story, you know, all the Atlantic, but not only that, you know, kind of world history is based on free labor or slave labor. So how do we do that, and how do we think about it today? Remember, there's 500,000 women trafficked annually for the purpose of sex slavery. So the city itself, and this is what is interesting, is that the project itself, you know, in a certain way, makes us remember, makes us think, you know, of the city of Nantes, which was the premier slave trading port in France, with about 46% of 4,000 slave trade expeditions. You know, about 500,000 people were transported in slave ships from Nantes. Nantes has decided to uncover, unearth, and confront its own difficult past. You know, and this memorial, as an evocation of the struggle, you know, is historic but continues in the present. It's located in the riverfront in the city of Nantes, in the Loire, on the Loire River, you know, and as Jean-Marc Ayrault, you know, who was the mayor, our client, and now is French Prime Minister, said, the memorial demonstrates this strong political will. It is not another act of contrition, which is the state of feeling remorseful and penitent, but as a genuine call to us all to remember past struggles in order to project ourselves into the future, fighting against all modern forms of slavery and denial of human rights in order to build a more united world. You know, again, in the city of Nantes, you can see this is the site. This is Jean Nouvel Palace of Justice, and you see the texture of the city. The site is about 400 meters, 350 meters long. You know, and as Jean-Marc Ayrault again says, by building a memorial on the banks of the Loire in the heart of a city, and at the point from which slave trading expeditions departed, and by giving it a monumental artistic form linked to the Palace of Justice, you know, we recall the fact that the struggle for freedom and dignity for all human beings is a fundamental cause inextricably linked to our vision of society. Again, he says, the memorial, which is unique in its scale in Europe, is a message from the people in Nantes and hopes to become a living place for collective commitment to a memory of the past and to continue our struggle for recognition and promotion of human rights. The city has set itself a very difficult task, has turned its architecture and its official public space into the grand reinscription and disruptive narrative, you know, that this project starts to suggest. The project, again, is part of a multi-layered approach that includes 1.5 kilometer long, you know, meandering around the city with markers around the place and connected to the Museum of Nantes, which is further away. And I'm going to try to go a bit faster, if you don't mind. So this site basically, is a site that involves a transformation of a pre-existing space, and these diagrams will show the transformation very clearly. First, you see in the section, can you see here? This was all mud, and parking above. We rediscovered the space and inhabited this space with people to create this memorial. The memorial itself, transformed the site, and the interior space that you saw, the previous structure, is kind of this space that was a residue of construction of the port of 18th, 19th, and 20th century. It transformed this from parking, to memorial space. So this project is based on this situation that speaks for itself, tells the story of the city. The project basically has to do with the notion of texts and resistance inscribed in glass. A glass that cuts the city and marks and transforms the ground of the city itself. A glass that changes its tone according to the reflection of light. Is a glass that is designed not to reflect but to emit light in a different way. But Nantes, again, statistically, involve about half of all French expeditions, which in a way, as a form of an archive, is inscribed in the ground of the city in this way. There are about 2,000 of these little glass plaques, that basically have names, beautiful names like Happy Mary, Maria Rose, Le Petit Lion. There are other ones that are called La Justice. But people are in search of memory, and this is what interests me here in terms of what happened in the space. People look for memory. La Thérèse, a name called L'Amour, you can see, love. A slave ship called Love. L'Africain. But all this started with the notion that behind what we see, we have to excavate the city to find traces of a story that was there. And actually, we were told that the space that we decided to, in our sketches, we thought we should excavate behind what we saw. The sketches, people in the city sent us documents that prove that that space already existed. So the project became a transformation, an adaptation. And you see the structure of the 20th century and the wall of the 19th century, and you walk by the wall, and it's about 150 meters long underground space, a football and a half field long. And there's a small space that tells us a story, a small information area, But the whole project is about this, transformation of an existing space, residual space, from mud, to this. Inhabitation is what interests us. The notion is that we commemorate the struggle, by inscriptions, by glass, by cutting the ground, by transforming the space, by telling a story of construction, again, from computer to the reality. And how the city tells a story of, let's say, a story of its own crime is an interesting question. And I want to end, if you allow me, 4 more minutes, Hassan, to show one quick movie, because it will, sorry about this, the sound. I'll move the sound so we can see it. But basically, this will help you visualize some of our conditions.
Plus de 27 000 expéditions négrières ont été recensées au départ des ports européens entre le XVe et le XIXe siècle. Elles arrachèrent plus de 12,5 millions d'hommes, femmes et enfants à la terre d'Afrique pour les réduire en esclavage en Amérique et aux Antilles. Plus d'1,5 million de personnes moururent pendant la traversée.
And you see here the kind of inhabitation of the space, the transformation of a space that was flooded with water, most of the time, into a space that became the core space of the memorial. So and again, it's a kind of an archaeological transformation, but it's a transformation that preserves the history of the place and transforms it to tell a story, of the port itself, a port that basically had about 2,000 expeditions coming from this port. And you see how the light, transform the space as it reflects from the water upwards. You can see the conditions of the space. How the glass cuts the ground and transforms a place.
L'esclave de l'esclavage est celui qui ne veut pas savoir. Édouard Glissant.
This is the day of the opening about a year ago.
Toutes les formes d'oppression, d'esclavage, d'exploitation humaine, de discrimination, ça reste un combat d'aujourd'hui. Comprendre notre histoire, comprendre les mécanismes de l'histoire, ça nous donne davantage d'élan, ça nous donne davantage de force pour le faire.
That's Jean-Marc Ayrault, who was the mayor of the city of Nantes, and now he's the French prime minister. And speaking about the mission, let's say the political mission of this memorial, and his call, as you will see in a moment.
Vers le passé, nous sommes tournés vers le présent et l'avenir. Et le mémorial est un lieu à la fois pour se souvenir, pour comprendre, mais c'est aussi un lieu pour réfléchir pour aujourd'hui.
Je me dis que c'est horrible, tous les gens qui sont morts dans cette souffrance et les enfants qui sont obligés de travailler.
Je lance ici, de Nantes, aujourd'hui, un appel solennel à tous les citoyens français à lutter sans faiblesse contre toute forme de racisme, d'antisémitisme, contre toute forme d'esclavage et d'exploitation de l'être humain dans le monde.
And this space where you see the Palace of Justice is the place where present-day slavery is described and the laws against all forms of slavery are discussed. So the story of this memorial is a memorial that, hope we will work. But the reality of the story is that the only witness of the story is the water. And the embankment of the port suggests that in a certain way, that's what we call the kind of witnesses, of the story are, again, the small little pieces, the small little particles of water that tell a story. So just to conclude, I want to thank you, but let me just show you one last image that will help us simply, which is, if I find it, yeah, is this photo. I want to end with this photo because I think it's very moving for me, very important. I was there about a year after the memorial opened with my kids, and I saw this, and I didn't want anybody to know that I was there, and I never knew if I should take this photograph or let alone show it or share it. And I said to myself, why not? Because in a certain way it captures the certain potency that space produced in this woman, from African descent, which I have never spoken with, and this is with her son. And in a certain way, for me, the kind of the power of space to somehow tell a story, the existing conditions and almost like the limited, palette of things that we do here, which are very complex in terms of constructing a dam under the ground, against the flooding of the water, all to produce a kind of an effect, that is about certain emptiness, but it's about the presence of space telling a story and inviting reflection, emotions, and evocation. But none of this space and this moment was not about us, it was about them. And for me, this is the kind of what I hope is what we can convey with our memorial spaces, is that space itself can help us tell stories, but frame the stories for the present, for people who inhabit the world today. Thank you very much.
I'm just opening the floor to questions, actually. And we had started with the conversations about trying to define memory and memorial's legacy. And I was just wondering if anyone had any comments on that after having seen these two similar in some ways and different in many other ways approaches. So I'm opening this to the floor, and I'm going to hand this over to you guys. Any questions?
I think, just to frame the discussion, is this?
Yeah.
I think there is a fundamental difference between the roadside memorial to a car crash victim and society's response to an act of war. And between the two, there's a lot of stuff. And there's obviously room for all of it. And so I think that unique situations require unique responses. And all of our projects have memory in common as an objective, right? But for instance, at the World Trade Center, whether you lived or you died, had only to do where you were at that moment in time. Nothing else. If you were above where a plane hit, you died. If you were below, the chances are you survived. That to me is a very different context than a grieving parent dealing with a unique event. But maybe it isn't. This is of my pay grade.
So open for questions. Why don't we get some comments and questions, and then we can fire.
There's a third piece of the roadside memorial, and these, the 9/11 and the slavery, abolition of slavery. I recently read David McCullough's Americans in Paris. There's a long segment about St. Gaudens and the work that he did on the fabulous sculptures, monuments. You know, having grown up in New York, there's several of them in New York, and is it the case that we as a society have moved or are moving away from those, I guess, more celebratory monuments, whether it's Lord Nelson in London or, I mean, these are so profound, and I found myself, I've seen Julian's presentation several times recently. I haven't been wrapped up in the 9/11 memorial for some time. I found myself very, very disturbed by reliving all of that. And I think that's important. I think that's why these structures are important. Does that make the magnificent sculptures of St. Gaudens less important?
No.
But they're different.
They're different.
Are we doing that
No,
anymore?
But I actually wanna shed a different perspective, because it's not either or. I think that there's an aspect that interests me more than the world memorials, which is memory. That defines, as humans, memory is what we are. The capacity to remember, the capacity to act in the world is connected to memory. And I'm not talking about only, the events, or those magnificent stories, or I'm saying even brushing your teeth in the morning is connected to brain, and the conditions that we have for memory. If we had to learn every morning, to write, or who we are, and we see this all the time, with kind of diseases, Alzheimer's and all that. So the notion of memory is very significant for us. And in architecture is significant because it's connected to space. It's connected to space because any time we go through some place, we remember something else. If you smell, you go through the streets, and you smell beautiful cookies, you remember your grandmother's house, in a second, or in less than a second. So the capacity to evoke, this is what I'm interested in. And that means, in a certain way, I'm not interested in tragedy, as such. I'm interested in ethics. I'm interested in the idea that spaces can invite thinking and can invite dialogue. And framing dialogue could be figurative or could not be figurative. There is an issue about the kind of a question of figurative world in terms of description of events, representations of events. As I try to unfold briefly there, to me there's an issue with traumatic events and the difficulty to tell the story, with an image, says, what is that? I have personally a problem with it. That doesn't mean that should not happen, but the problem I have is that I feel somehow strongly that there's a space that we cannot enter, and that's the space of the suffering of the other. So the moment that kind of figurative sculptures to try to evoke and represent that, I'm not sure it can address that. Again, that's a personal, but it's also kind of a philosophical question about representation. But to me, memory, perhaps with Mr. Ruskin, is a lamp, sheds, light over the present. All these events, for me, are not about us looking at the past. These events and these people and the vanquished are still waiting for us to respond to them. They are looking at us.
I think one thing that, if we can refer to both sessions a little bit, sorry about that, but the clarity of the heroes and the victims that was raised, there's, and that's, any clarifications might be too simplistic, but that's very powerful. The clarification of, instead of looking at an object or a figure and inhabiting a space, it seems like, and then this is a comment. It's not a. It's going further. Is seeing the presentations made me think of an essay by William James, who wrote an essay called "The Moral Equivalent of War." And you said earlier you were interested in ethics, and it seems like one of the issues raised there was that so far we have focused on war for calling, or violence in either cases, heroes and victims, and calling up honor, dedication, camaraderie, sacrifice. And 100 and however many years ago, 105 years ago, he says, what if we thought of those? How do we call forth those other things? It makes me think that we're very uncivilized, even in our best moments in recalling and thinking about the memories of people and calling them into our lives now and making amends or trying to be different. We don't have the response that I think Maya is seeking of the more, another celebratory, we have heroes who we're not like, and we have victims who we hope would never have to be anymore. We haven't figured out a democratic world, let alone a democratic architecture that helps us find a way that is less traumatic. And I'm not diminishing the things, and I may be just off on another conference, but it raises the idea that I think we all are seeking to believe that we can have architecture evoke the positive qualities of a non-militaristic top-down, or a non-victimized by whatever random acts we all fear, or intentional ones like slavery. We still don't have a kind of democratic or a mass society other than in recognizing heroes or victims. And I may be off, but does that respond to some degree? And I think it's really interesting, and I'm not faulting anything, but I think
but I actually,
maybe I'm off.
No. I think
it's part of a conversation.
To me, this is an very interesting dilemma. But to me, democracy is a construction. It's a kind of a process of construction, and it's inviting reflections about our own society in all its, call it goods and evils. But I don't like this idea that we always end up kind of with dichotomies of polarization of of concepts. For me, the question of democracy is at the heart of everything we do. Is a working process. Is the idea inviting the voices of those who do not have a voice to be in public.
Well, but also, I think what the examples shown that are born of such horrific violence, or of such sustained violence that wasn't horrific enough, but it became horrific as the accumulation of all the all the using of humans for such a long time became apparent, you know, it raises an issue of, will we make public space based on more positive generators and things that have the power of these traumas? How do we, again, I think that's one of the issues that comes up. I'm not saying it's dichotomous or against what's shown, but it just raises the issue. We all feel that when we go to these places that are so powerful, the memorials, and I just, you know, I think that's part of what's coming up that's very powerful.
Well, if I could, I mean, it's a really interesting question because, I mean, transposed, the question becomes, what is as meaningful, as powerful, as motivating as death and suffering?
Yeah.
And I don't say that for the sake of exploiting the notion of death, but I say that when you confront these things, you confront the limit of human experience.
Yep.
Because you're confronting the limit of human experience, you are motivated to express something that is beyond words.
Yep.
And you are pushed to a level of where you need the infinite because you literally are at the end of finite life.
Yep.
I mean, we have this, I mean, this is what, in some ways, I think is so powerful about some of the 9/11 material, that the kind of confrontation that I'm talking about, which had been written about, which had been described in the past, was witnessed by millions of people, hundreds of millions of people around the world. And this was acted out as a public drama, but as a real thing. There's a photograph, I think Steve showed the puncture point, if I could call it, of the plane that hit the North Tower. We actually have a photograph. There's this gigantic gaping hole which spans 6 stories and goes. There's a photograph of a woman standing in that hole. She's wearing, you know, it's a summer day. She's wearing white clothes. So you look at that photograph, and all of a sudden, you are witnessing not just the end of her life, but you are witnessing sort of this metaphysical condition of what the end of existence is, and the confrontation of having no choice.
Yep.
And I don't know, I mean, the William James analogy, I remember reading that essay. You know, what is the equivalent? There is no equivalent to that, because there is no equivalent that brings you to the depths of human experience in that way, where the cost is the end of your own or someone else's human experience.
You know, it was very interesting over the past 9 years. It's actually been, for me, it's been longer than 9 years. I view architecture as I do politics. I'm kind of a Manchester liberal. That I know what I know and I don't know what I don't know, and my experience is what I can bring to the table, and I can study, I can do research, I can try to understand, I can, but at the end of the day, I'm, you know, I. So, I don't try to answer questions with architecture that I don't understand. I can only address what I do understand. It's an irony that isn't lost on many that I watched that plane go by the window and I wound up with this commission. But that wasn't the informant for what transpired and the process and the solution. I think that if we're honest, and there's a real lack of that, then we should all be striving to be the second dumbest person in the room, or at least close to it. Because what's left on the table, I think, that we can appropriate for our benefit, for the projects that we do, for our clients, for the users, for the environment, that if we leave anything on the table, then we've not done our job. It was a real circus designing at 9/11. You can't imagine what a circus. Cliff is the only person in the room, I think, that actually was, you know, touched by how circus-like it was. And You know, I admire horses a lot because they have a way of putting things out of their mind and just going. And so it's not particularly intellectually stimulating to describe process in these terms. It's all very personal. It's all very individual. But all I think any of us can offer anything is ourselves, right?
Absolutely.
Which is where the honesty part comes in.
Yeah.
Maybe let me add one more thing to that. When we worked as well a long time, you know, this started like 2000. Our project first presentation was in 2004, you know, to the mayor of the city. And we worked for about a year without showing any drawings, anything, you know, because we need to understand what we're trying to achieve, you know, and then we made a presentation, and it was 10 minutes with the mayor. That's it. Likes it, not likes it. A year of work, and yeah, and that 10 minutes became an hour and a half, 2 hours, because he was interested in what we were doing. You know, in our research and our investigation, but especially in this notion that spaces can create a kind of a sense of continuity and a sense of understanding. That's what started, you know, the kind of this conversation, at least there in Nantes. It was very strange as well, you know, because we're coming from, you know, Cambridge and New York, and, you know, Polish and Argentinian, you know, half Jewish, you know, my partner, I'm Jewish both sides, I think, but, you know, how are we doing, you know, with this project, you know, about slavery and the story of slavery in France? And I think it has to do with a kind of ethical commitment to sort of humanity, you know, to those voices that, you know, that are not heard. And we had to go through commissions, and we had to go through kind of negotiations, and we had to go through cost estimation, and, you know, reducing this and all of that. But what moved me tremendously, I was telling Erica at lunch, was the fact that, you know, as you see here in this photo, people stay there for hours. They walk, and people are saying that they go there every week just to think, you know, and just to look at the water and to imagine, you know, and to contemplate, and, you know, and in a certain way, you know, again, as you said, Steve, this is what we offer, you know, this is what we offer, what we can offer, you know. And yes, of course, we can come from many different kind of angles, you know, in terms of the understanding, you know, and there are many stories that we could tell about, you know, our own projects in terms of process. I always joke that the mayor will never know that I slept, you know, 3 days or 4 days on the floor, you know, cold, you know, where we're doing the renderings, you know, for our 10 minutes presentation. He will never know that, you know. Who cares? This is what I'm trying to say. There's a moment in which our own experience can never legitimate our work, you know. It legitimates what we do for others, but the work itself is in the public, and the work itself is the public, you know. And to me, that's what is interesting. It's I think what I tried to suggest at the beginning, you know, that society is a miracle of moving out of oneself, and in a certain way, not me, but Levina suggests that. And to me, that's the ethical dimension. So we do this, but it's for others, you know, and it comes from us as an offering, but it's always for others and goes to others. And to me, this is the power of architecture. It's not a question of representation. It's just incredibly strong. And it's quite liberating to be able to move out of oneself, you know, in this society that is so centered on oneself, let's say. Yeah?
I was going to say, just commenting, I mean, learned quite a lot from you. I don't know if this is probably, maybe this is, you said this to me, but I guess, I don't know if this just came to you. I don't know if it's the definitive or just something throughout, like the difference between back to the monumental legacy and memories. Like the monument, when you leave, life is not present there, or maybe it's not about the absence of that. But with the memorial, it's life is present when you leave, and it's also the absence of that life in the memorial. So that in both the projects, it kind of applies. So when you're there, you know, life is there, just whether it be the water and the noise and whatnot, or when you leave, it's the absence that there's no longer life that is there. It still kind of applies, but there was something there at one point. I think that kind of both communicates that idea of kind of not experiential, but the omnipresent, you know, whatever force may be there, whatever you're religious or not, but there's something that, I guess, the materiality that communicates to you, or the sound, the smell, the senses, that indicates for you to just want to stay there. And that has a little bit maybe more to do with the memorial than the monument, which is, I don't know, it's just a notion of it being less cold and less present in the space, but I just thought I'd throw that.
I'm wondering, Stephen, if you could talk a little bit more about issues of authenticity. Why is authenticity so important in memorial making, or is it important, or how do we assume that it's important? I know publics assume, but why are we talking so much about authenticity in memorial making today? We weren't doing that 50 years ago, 100 years ago.
Well, I wasn't talking about anything 100 years ago, so my reference is shorter than that. I think that authenticity can't be manipulated. That it's either authentic or it isn't authentic, and it's verifiable. Legacy perhaps is manipulable. This is stuff for us to discuss. This isn't absolute. I watch politicians create legacies which are not authentic, and time has a way of revealing this kind of stuff.
I have no idea. I'm just asking.
No, it's a good, and this is what I was hoping we would start to talk about.
I mean,
because
when I think authenticity, I think honesty, trustiness, or whatever it is Stephen Colbert says. Truthiness, that's it.
Truthiness, I like
truthiness. And it's a huge issue today, for all sorts of reasons.
Yeah, and for us, it was worth fighting nearly to the death to align those fountains with those column bases. Because when you're suspended 50 feet in the air, and you can, in your mind, can connect the surface of those volumes with their relationship to those column bases, if it was off a meter, it would all be a lie. To propose a memorial which occupies the footprints of the, and then to find out it didn't. I mean, there are all these. There's this joke about going to see the guru on the mountain, and life is a bowl of cherries. Come back in a year, and it comes back and he says, "I discovered that it isn't." So, I think we take all of this stuff very seriously, but it doesn't. But as long as the conversation isn't somehow shrouded or manipulated or controlled, that it turns out okay. So it was important to us that the notion that these elements of the memorial site, which we were obligated to make available, were not manipulated, were not somehow distorted, that they were transparently revealed. Maybe they're attractive, maybe they're unattractive, maybe they tell you things you don't want to know, maybe you're desperate to have the knowledge, but that wasn't our decision to make. Our decision, our responsibility was to make these things available without manipulation, not through some lens with an agenda. You'll make up your mind what you think, but you'll get to make up your mind. As
It
opposed
starts to
to,
feel-
taking a novel, making a very expensive movie, which is just a tiny slice of it, and present through a lens that just doesn't tell the story at all. We didn't do that. I mean, you have no idea what a struggle it was to resist the desire to manipulate from every direction.
Some of what you're saying starts to feel dogmatic. I don't think the purpose is to. I think that there's a resonance in lining up things with the original structure. It makes me think of what was there before the structure was. What is the history of that particular piece of land that had a history before the building was built? And I think that in the discussion of whether the roadside accident and a political terrorism I think they have a relationship with each other, but essentially the memorials seem to be more about demonstrating purposeful exploitation. That it's when we as humans either are aware or not aware of our purposeful exploitation is when we're at our worst. And the roadside accident is more about the fate of the person at that particular time, but the destruction of the towers is a purposeful exploitation. And we hope that that's not in us, but we always see that there is, because of the things that we do on a personal level that we're not proud of. And I think that's where some of the resonance, and I like, Julian, your response that it's an ethical response, that it's an ethical teaching in these memorials, and that you hope that they go away because we'll no longer need them because we've learned. But it disturbs me when it becomes dogmatic, that it has to be this way in order for somebody else to understand that, because then it's about visiting the piece, about buying the milkshake that tastes the same in any city because it's from McDonald's and it's a coffee milkshake. I would rather deal with the ethics in teaching people, which is a mobile transport, than to have that you have to visit the piece in order to understand the history.
I don't think you have to visit the piece. I think you have to respect the logical decision-making that was made within a very tight and difficult environment to accomplish a mission that we signed up for. It didn't. So dogmatic, non-dogmatic. That's why that was my point about being a Manchester liberal. I can only, you can elect somebody, but at the end of the day, you've elected them, right? You get the package. So what we tried to do was try to be logically consistent and ethical in our decision making, to not be overly influenced by what was an incredibly stressful environment, to influenced by many vectors of agenda. We didn't get to pick and choose which agendas we were going to support or reject.
So somebody else?
We had to just make decisions to accomplish a task which was complicated and had, our souls committed to it in a way that I guess I'm not communicating very well, but certainly we were anything but dogmatic in our approach to accomplishing this. But we saw logical decisions that had to be made in a sequence in order to keep it moving. You go to the train station to expect the train to arrive. 4 hours later, you're sore if that train doesn't arrive. But setting the schedule is not problematic. It's it's the result of a series of expectations that have consequences for lots of other things. She is a strange analogy. It's just, I spent 7 hours driving here.
I think that the comparison might be useful to help illustrate the difference between Julian's project, in which, well, maybe the comparison is not relevant, but there was so much pressure, there was so much intensity around the World Trade Center that all these powerful forces, in a way, is it fair to describe it as something where I imagine that the powerful forces hopefully cancel each other out and create like a partial vacuum within which every move you make is under such intense scrutiny that there is no possibility. It simply rules out the possibility of anything that might be construed as a manipulation. Is that getting at the conditions?
Well, I think we all have opinions. You know, I don't know anybody of intelligence that doesn't have fairly strong opinions about a lot of things. And certainly I'm among the most opinionated. But I had decades of experience being an architect before I began to work on this. So, you know, I was not an ingenue. We, as a firm, we are not ingenues.
Let me add one thing to that. Robert, I think that, you know, the question of the intensity of the scrutiny, you know, is different in French than in English. You know, but I can assure you, you know, it was an incredibly strong and very difficult process at that level too, because of all the groups, but also because of what I call the weight of history. You know, and to me that goes beyond the politician, but that goes to the heart of politics. You know, and the weight of history, we're talking about centuries. We're talking about millions of human beings that were enslaved, transported, you know, and a continent that was decimated and transformed by this story. We're talking about the whole Western life, you know, being supported by free labor, you know, throughout centuries. And we're talking about the questions that are still in the present, today. You know, and to me, to be able to only scratch the surface of that has an incredible weight. And sometimes I feel it physically. But who cares? That's what I'm trying to say. You know. But there's another aspect, which is the public scrutiny in terms of public funds. You know, that were very significantly targeted, let's say, by, you know, the city council. It's absolutely public project and has a different kind of a perception of what the kind of processes in the US and in Europe are very different in terms of public processes and what it means to appropriate, you know, public funds to do this kind of work. And the pressure that people felt, you know, as well, because there were some few supporters and a good amount of enemies, people who thought we should not do anything, people who said, why would we destine 400 meters of the prime, you know, coast of the city to do this project? Why would we do that? You know, what city in the world, you know, destines the prime public space, you know, as a kind of a 400 meters, again, think about that scale, to be this project, to be such a kind of project. You know, and the mayor supported it. And there were moments in which he had to back off, you know, and we were faced with boom, 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 slaps all over. And, you know, it happens in every project. But to me, the question, the ethical question is how we address this larger question that comes from the weight of history. You know, that perhaps is not answerable, but still we have to try to address it with all the defects and the problems. I'm sorry.
We have two last questions. And then we should
I'm not even going to make a question. I can understand clearly what they're saying. And you had a project that was quite different. It had a lot of force behind it that affected public and a whole lot of things. But why aren't we as a profession digging whenever we get some fresh project? And yeah, I realize it's fresh, but it's dynamic and it took time. I had a project somebody asked me about today, Joslin Diabetes Foundation. It was an interesting thing because diabetes, when we got this was 1960 something, and it was one in which Dr. Joslin had founded a way in which attacking diabetes was really something special, and they put me through. Now, I became a patient for 24 hours, and they had everything. They did educational periods. They had inpatients. They had. It was a very complex group of things, and really lived it. I mean, there was mothers with a baby that had diabetes, and she would stay there with the child. You had teenagers. You had and you had research going on, etc. But this doctor I never met. I remember his son was a doctor, and I met him, and I met a whole lot of others. I went to class because they gave classes for their patients. Out of this came the kind of enthusiasm you're talking about. Maybe not such a big important thing, but it was really quite important for that particular client. And the project we did was very, very different, and it really set out a whole new way to treat both in and outpatients, inpatients that weren't there for surgery, but inpatients who were there for balancing their intake of insulin, food, exercise, etc. We created a gym, we created all kinds of things, and we came back afterwards to do quite a bit. I think we need to go after, we need, as architects, to dig and find the history of things. It's not just another developer that wants to do an office building he's going to make money from. It's a project by which there are really core history and themes that really need to be played out. The Icon project I want to get into, it was a double whammy. I spent a month going through Islam, countries, history of culture. I spent almost a year doing different concepts that we kept putting in front of His Highness. He said, no way, etc., my history, etc. You remember some of this, don't you? I mean, it was like hitting a wall. All I can say is that was 1970 to, hey, I'll be with him till I'm dead. He's told me that. And the reason is you really get where you guys got on this thing. And maybe yours is a lot more important what I was doing. But it is a theme of what we as professionals, there's so many projects come to you. The budget's this, the piece of land's there, etc. Instead of saying, boy, there's a lot of history and a lot we need to dig for.
Yeah.
And I really think that is a driving force that should connect with, our clients and our culture and etc. I completely concur with what you're talking about, and I know the feeling.
I guess quickly, I think, and I'll try to be brief. I think, Stephen, the thing is that I know from my own work with memorials, it's an issue of ownership. Everyone has experienced what happened with 9/11, so everyone feels a part of it. Some have much more power because of resources and political things. So the ownership of it, this tug of war that goes back and forth, and I think what you've done is a tremendously great project. It's so difficult. I remembered when I designed the Kent State Memorial, I was asked, well, who is this memorial for? Of course, it's for the 4 students that were shot at Kent State. It's for the 9 students that were one severely wounded. And then I said, it's also for the guardsmen. And then everybody sort of perked up. Why is it for them? Because I said, it has to be about closure, it has to be about forgiveness. Many of the guardsmen were ROTC, which were a part of the university. Somebody had thrown firecrackers later that they've discovered only in the last 5 years that went off. They were ordered to open fire. It wasn't the guardsmen's fault, but some people took offense to that. So everybody owns a part of this thing. The second thing is I think the incompleteness of memorials and how we create them, but there's also, as Julian has said so beautifully and eloquently, there's a larger part of it. I was reminded in teaching a seminar on memorials many years ago, and a student, we were talking about Maya Lin's memorial and how I think it's one of the best things that's ever been designed, and everybody agreed. And a student, he put his hand up and he said, yes, it is a great memorial, but it's incomplete. It shouldn't just be where it is. One wall should stretch, and he had done this calculation, almost to the Capitol, and the other one would go almost to the Pentagon, because it has 58,000 names on it, but how many 100,000 Vietnamese died in that war? And if we're going to make a memorial to the Vietnam War, we need to include everyone and the women that were raped and everything else that goes with it. So I think it's a struggle when we think about these things. You know, we have this 9/11, and when it happened, the first question is, why is this happening? Have we done something to cause this? And then afterwards, we considered it an act of war, and then we attacked another country that we found out wasn't responsible for this. And so how is this incomplete story, you know, do we build a 9/11 memorial and museum, and then we add another museum 50 years from now that tells the whole story before and afterwards? And so there's an incompleteness about memorials that I think is very, very important.
Okay, do you want to have last words, or this is it?
I'm not sure that was a question.
No, it wasn't. Well,
Let me say-
last comments.
Let me make one.
We should close.
Okay. Well, two things. The first thing, as I said at the beginning, we clearly know that memory is not easy, you know, and memory, you know, as a subject is kind of very complex, you know, as all the examples that we have in mind, you know, kind of illuminate or clarify. But I want to add one more thing, which has to do with one of the things that we were able to, I think, accomplish there, which is not seen, which is the notion that we insisted from the beginning that there should be an institute in the city of Nantes to the investigation and discussion and transformation of present-day slavery. And that was kind of a key component of what we thought programmatically the project should have. The project was defeated because it doesn't have that, you know. It doesn't have that institute, you know, that we thought it was important within the context of the memorial. But two things happened that changed, you know, a little bit that perspective. First is that the mayor, and now prime minister, is adamantly insisting in many of his speeches, in many of his presentations, about the problem of sex trafficking and human trafficking today. That's interesting, because once you begin that process and instilling in kind of powerful people certain ideas, somehow if they own it, they begin to own it, that becomes important. The second part is that Nantes created an institute of high studies, an institut de haute étude, for the relation North and South. And in that place, they bring scholars from Africa, you know, I don't know, 10 scholars a year, you know, to do investigations and to do research on questions of the relation between, you know, Africa and Europe. We could not claim that we said, oh, let's make an institute for the high studies of the relation North and South. But the ideas that come from notions that connect to certain forms of exploitation, you know, of the relation North and South, are being in Nantes discussed was important. And I think that's part of the kind of what projects can bring to the table. So, thank you.
Well, we're going to have another day, so...
We do. We have another day,
but
absolutely.
I listened to a lot of radio. And there was a show recently, a segment of Radio Lab, which was devoted to memory. And it was really a dark, it is a dark show, but this was a particularly dark one. And the conclusion that I came away with as I went into the Midtown Tunnel and lost the station is that you exist as long as somebody has a reason to remember you. That's right. So that gives a lot of that gives a lot of importance to memorials.
Okay, I just have a couple of announcements, and I would like to say something that, listening to this, it strikes me that, of course, we're talking about. Sorry. Hello. That we're talking about things that are reactive. Memorials are reactive to something. And the question is the other programs that maybe become proactive towards something else. So the act of remembering is, perhaps it is about the past, but we've, the mayor and now Prime Minister said we want to look towards the future. And to me this is a dilemma, because in the end the memorials are about telling a story of the past and maybe interpreting it, and it might change our interpretations of it. But then how do we think about what this means for slavery in the future? And it seems that you need another program beyond the memorial in order to think about that. So I'm not sure. So the role of memorials and what they can do becomes quite important. But I'll leave that for the moment, and we'll come back to other questions. I would just say that I want to thank you both, and thank you all for your comments.